All right, we are live with Sunyi Dean. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you so much. So would you mind introducing yourself right off the bat and just a little bit about you before we begin?
I'm Sunyi. I'm a kind of mixed race autistic writer. Was born in Texas and grew up in Hong Kong, and I live in the UK. That's all kind of standard stuff for my bio. I write weird fiction, and I have too many children and not enough books.
And if nobody gets past this point in the interview, if they didn't know your work and you were to give them a reason that they should try and pick it up, what would you say to them?
It's very weird and unexpected.
If you like weird and unexpected, you're ready to go. You have been featured in the best of British sci-fi anthology, Prole, FFO, Tor.com, and The Book Eaters is your debut novel, but not your first. Would you like to tell us about that kind of fledgling effort that happened before Book Eaters?
Yes, I think when I was about 29, I hit my midlife crisis a little bit early.
A very short life.
Yeah, I realized I hadn't ever written anything really. I'd had the idea to and never done it, and it was stressing me out. I think I had this unhealthy idea that you've got to write before you're 30, which a lot of people have on Twitter, and it was stressing me out that I hadn't written. So I started writing and finished the first draft of something in about 4 months, and it was really, really terrible. So I just kept rewriting it. And I queried it way too early. It had nothing but rejections. Eventually I let it go and tried again with the second book. That did get me one agent offer, but after a year and a half, it didn't sell to publishers. So I wrote a third book, and that's this one, The Book Eaters. It was called Paper Flesh while I was writing it, and it was just a kind of hodgepodge of different things, my attempt to be less weird and a little bit more accessible.
So the path of true love never did run smooth. I mean, this is yet another example of you don't just submit and get published and you're done. Did you have a point where you like needed to get over the hump and give yourself that dose of enthusiasm? Did you lean on other people for that? How did you get past that early stage to where you're like, okay, I'm going again?
I think naivety and kind of, I thought, like, I gave myself 2 years. I thought 2 years is loads of time. You know, if you're going to get published, it'll happen in 2 years, not knowing anything about the industry.
Right.
Yeah. At the end of 2 years, I wasn't, anywhere close, but it's fine. And I think, every time I start a revision, I think this is it. I've finally nailed the concept of the book. And I think that for the following 10 times. And I guess I just have this capacity to always be optimistic about about the revision or about the query that I'm sending. I always think this will be it, and then it isn't, and eventually it is, but it just takes a long time. Yeah, I do have a writing group, so I guess shout out to kind of Writer Alliance and Write or Die, and
Write or Die.
Yeah. Just little Discord groups where kind of people I've known for a while, and we kind of talk about books, and we still keep each other going through the long, dark stretches.
Okay, so I've got a personal question.
Yeah.
You are active on Discord. You're delightful to talk to. So much fun, so much information. And 2 or 3 months ago, vapor, right?
Yeah.
You disappear into the ether. And then boom, like a week ago, you're back.
Oh.
What have you been working on? What are you doing with your time?
I really had to get serious about the next novel. I took a year and a half trying to draft an outline, which is a ridiculous amount of time. It was just writing outlines and chucking them and writing them and chucking them and getting feedback on them and then chucking them. So I finally pinned an outline down sometime over the summer. And then now I've got deadlines for it. So when I reached a kind of certain point where the book became stable, it settled down a little bit.
Right. Finally back to the point where you can engage with other human beings without detracting from the work.
Yeah, without procrastinating constantly.
Yeah. It's the easiest thing in the world to do. I'm very, very curious about you in terms of your upbringing. Because you were born in the States, you were raised in Hong Kong, you live in Yorkshire now. Before pre-puberty, were you like this rambunctious kid? Were you this intellectual? Were you this lost in the books type of kid? Like, who were you growing up?
I did read very early. I think they call it hyperlexia, which is it occurs sometimes in autism. You read very early, either read very early or very late. It's always into the extreme.
Okay.
So I did read a lot and I read very early. Probably a very like lone wolf kid, not a huge amount of friends. Very religious upbringing. My parents are very, very conservative, religious, still are.
Mm-hmm.
My mother is a Buddhist who's now a born again Christian. So even though she's Chinese, yeah. Very religious, but lots of books. Sci-fi very early on, fantasy early on. I disagree with my dad on a lot of things, but we share a love of Lord of the Rings and Star Trek.
Okay. And was he encouraging you early on? Was he feeding the machine and giving you the books and encouraging you to try this?
Yeah, he would read. He used to read Tolkien to me at bedtime at Lord of the Rings, and he would always say, "Don't read ahead of me," knowing that would have the opposite effect. So
of course I'm going to.
Yeah, so he did get me to kind of read early and to branch out, and they bought me loads of books at Walmart. They were always happy to feed the reading. I think they saw that as a good thing.
Absolutely. So during that time, were there books that struck you, that kind of grabbed you by the neck and said, come here? Were there things that opened up a new world? Like, what are the things that stand out to you during that time?
I think weirdly Jane Eyre stood out. I think that the passages, the book opens with her being this very kind of isolated child and struggling to communicate and having people around her not understand her. And I think that's a common experience for a lot of kids. And she wrote children so well, and she understood so much what it was like to be a child. I think that had a big impact. Star Trek had a big impact because it was like this, I didn't have the words for it then. It was like this big progressive socialist society that was amazing. And just kind of, it was a very different vision of the future from what we're told is possible. And I think that stuck with me as well.
That's always the great thing about Star Trek, is it's just got this hopeful version of the future where, you know, war and combat are down here and peace and recognition are way up on top. When you read, do you go for escapism? Do you go for the emotions that you get from those characters? Like what's the overall thing that you're looking for when you crack open a book?
I think probably a conversation with the author or their topic. So I've been reading an arc recently. I think I mentioned it in Discord. I'm reading Ascension by kind of Nicholas Benj, and it makes me want to like email the author and like write a long list of questions and have a chat with him, because I'm curious about his worldview now. Nice. I think the best books, I'm interested in the people who write them, what they're saying about themselves.
So it's really kind of about the relationship for you.
Yeah, I think they call it the seeking communion. You're kind of looking to communicate with the artist or the author.
Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, I love that. So when you're a kid, did you have a goal of being an astrophysicist or a geologist, or did you always want to be a writer or a truck driver? What were you interested in when you were a kid?
I just wanted to be a reader, but that's not a job.
Right.
I used to think, if you could just get a job reading books. I knew that librarians didn't do that because my dad was a librarian and he didn't hardly have time to read. So it was all about shelving books. No, I had no specific goal. I think I decided at some point in my teens that I wanted to be happy, and I wasn't really fussed what that looked like. And I wanted to write a book, but not necessarily be a writer, I guess.
Okay. So you started approaching it late teens?
I wrote fan fiction in my teens. I started writing really seriously when I was 29, so 29 and 30.
Okay, so kind of a 10-year period of playing footsie with it, and then, like you said, got serious before you're 30, because we have to write a book before we're 30. It's a law.
Well, I wrote fan fiction from probably about 14 to 18, and then I stopped, and there was just nothing for the next 9 or 10 years.
So was it just, I'm turning 30, or was there a seminal moment or something that you read that kind of kicked it into gear? Because you went from fanfic to nothing to, okay, I'm going to do this?
I think it's a combination of I hadn't succeeded in other careers. If I was good at anything else, I think I'd be doing something else. I'm just not a very useful person in the capitalist sense, I guess. I can't do jobs that require a lot of people interaction. It just wears me down. So it was a combination of that. And then, yeah, it was just staring 30 in the face and thinking I might die without having ever at least tried, which is a bit dramatic, but, I don't know. It felt like a big deal at the time. It felt like time was just crunching down on me.
Well, if you're a writer, you got to make it a little bit dramatic. That's where the fun comes in. So there's kind of pressure, ticking clock, and then you wrote a book, didn't get accepted, wrote a second book, didn't get accepted, wrote a third book, and boom, off we go. Here comes Harper Voyager. What was your experience like after years of trying and having it not work and, oh, gee, am I good enough? When somebody finally said yes, what was that moment like for you?
It was very surreal, and it was very fast because the first book that we had on submission took ages, like I think 18 months to collect rejections. That was the second one I wrote, and it didn't get anywhere. And the third one, I was expecting that same experience again, and then it sold in 4 days to tour, and I was just like literally in shock, basically. So I think I couldn't sleep for that whole night. My agent said after we'd done the deal, like, do you want to speak to the editor? And I said, I can't talk to her right now. I don't have my brain together. So we had to wait till the Monday after to even have a phone call. Because my head was everywhere.
Just over the moon. And was the process of getting the book published kind of like what you envisioned it, or was it an entirely different path than what you had assumed?
It was a lot better. Most of my friends have published mid-list and had experiences that I would say range from like really bad to okay. And my experience was generally very good, which is a huge privilege, and I'm grateful for that. So all the things that could go right for that book basically went right for the next 2 years. And it was like, yeah, this is very lucky. This is very, very lucky. It was a lot of editing, but I don't mind that. I don't mind working on it.
Yeah, well, we'll come back around to editing here in a second, but I'm kind of interested in when you first started approaching. I'm going to back up on myself. When you first start putting this book together, it was not at all the book that you wound up with, correct?
Yeah, more or less.
Almost unrecognizable from what your outline looked like. Is that true?
Yeah, I think I've got the original pitch letter that I wrote for my agent because I pitched her the project before writing it. And it has like a different plot. It mentions these people called the Sabbatarians who are the main antagonist, and they're not even in the finished book. So it was very different. It went on submission with the Sabbatarians, and then I rewrote about a third of it with editor's help. So
well, and you had a journey of discovery yourself while writing this, because there were some things that it was grounded in. And then I believe you said that the further you got into it, the more you recognized that you didn't have time for lore as much as you wanted to focus on story. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that?
I think because I wanted to explore the family relationships, I realized that I could either go down the path of exploring the lore and explaining everything, which would make the book fully fantasy, or I could focus on basically the family relationships, which does make the book more mainstream, because mainstream readers have very low tolerance for world building. If you're mainstream and you're listening to this, I'm very sorry, but it is true. Whereas fantasy readers, they'll read something that doesn't have a lot of explanation. They might grumble a bit, but they'll put up with it. And it was consciously kind of targeted at more mainstream, kind of Claire North type books, mainstream speculative fiction. So there was a load of lore, and it just got chucked in the end because there was no space without making it twice the word count.
Well, and I really admire that. And again, we'll come back around to editing again later. But one of the points that you wanted to make with the book was, and the Book Eaters is about people that consume books and they absorb the information that's inside. And one of the things that you wanted to talk about in this book was how we as a culture consume media. You want to talk a little bit about that?
I guess I was interested in how it affects us and how it changes us. I think there were a lot of restrictions on the books that I could read growing up, in terms of whether, and if something wasn't Christian, it had to be viewed as like, oh, this is secular. You have to bear that in mind. Like, you can read Nietzsche, but he's secular and he's like an evil atheist, and you have to think about that, and which isn't really a fair assessment of him, but it's that kind of thing. And I think that one of the churches I used to go to, they used to say something like, you are what you eat, you think what you read as well. And there was a lot of stuff around reading the right things and seeing the right media. And it does affect us. I think that's why people worry about it, the debate with schools and things that you guys have over there.
Yeah.
It's going down. It's something people worry about, that, it's a double-edged sword, I guess.
It's absolutely a double-edged sword. But like you said, when you're growing up and you've got that kind of repressive environment, it's almost forcing you in that direction to go sneak these books and read them. I mean, that was your experience, correct?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
One of the things I always liked about consuming books that are outside of my faith is that you get to absorb things vicariously and see things from different perspectives. And there's huge value in that.
Yeah.
So I really like the idea that you absorb what you read. You talk about how books taste. Please talk to me about that, because I think this is a phenomenal idea.
So the taste is a weird one, because they don't eat food. So you can't describe, like, you can't say, oh, this book tastes like a cheesecake, because that doesn't mean anything to a book eater. So they had to have tastes that were kind of abstract. And it was just, I guess, thinking about, there's an Orbit editor who has a form of synesthesia where books have a taste to her.
Yeah.
And she has described that on Twitter sometimes. And I find that really fascinating as a sensory thing. I think, she reads books, she's like, oh, I like the taste or don't of it. And it's like, that's amazing to me. I think, there's also a tea maker here in Yorkshire who he makes teas which taste like the way that fairy tales taste to him when he reads them, because he also has that synesthesia. So there are people that experience books in that way, which I would love to have that. But anyway.
Well, but I think you've provided that for the readers. How did you start, even begin to go about defining how a book tasted?
I think we used a lot of that language already, don't we? We kind of talk about books in food terms, so it's just an extension of that. We say things are spicy or sweet, and you kind of go from there, and what the book is about, what it makes you think of.
So, just out of curiosity, as a game, I was kind of interested to get your feeling on how a book would taste. And one of your favorites, at least one of the ones that you grew up with, was Lord of the Rings. How would Lord of the Rings taste? I know that's putting you on the spot. You don't have to.
No, it's fine. I think it would taste like I don't know. I think The Hobbit would taste like a full breakfast or something.
Oh.
Just because there's so much food in there, I guess. I don't know. I guess I think about Lord of the Rings and bright steel and things like that. It's a very weapon-focused book. Something metallic.
Nice. I'll throw another one out. Have you ever read First Law?
No.
Okay, let's try Mary Poppins.
I've seen the film.
That'll do.
Popcorn, maybe.
Perfect. And should we assume that Moby Dick tastes like a fish stick, or?
I think it'd be bitter. It's all about his kind of vengeance, isn't it?
Oh, I love that. Perfect. So with your book cover, and I mean book covers, what was the experience like having those presented to you? Did you have a hand in doing it? Was it kind of hands off and, oh, I see them and I check the box and off we go? Do you like the English version better than the American version? Because they're both fascinating and they both really get across the idea of the book very well. I'm just kind of curious about your experience with them, though.
So I think for Tor, we asked to have input, and that involved them sending updates as they were working on it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I would have actually had much say because I don't really. I know some authors go into it with a very strong idea of their cover, and I didn't. I'm not very designy or artsy.
Mm-hmm.
I think at one point they sent me one that was like an apple made of paper. I was like, oh, it looks a bit like Twilight. And I think they didn't like that because then they went and changed it to something else. But yeah, I love the artist they found. I thought Sue was great. Her paper art's really cool. The UK side, they just sent the cover and said, sorry, it's very different from the American one. Hope you don't mind. But I didn't mind. I do like the UK cover, actually. I like text-based, so I was fine with it. And I don't think I had a great deal of choice, but I was also okay with it. I minded the title change a bit more, but I got used to it.
And is picking one that you like more like choosing between your children, or is there one clear front runner?
I think the UK one, because it converts to different color schemes well. Like the Illumicrate version is just like a reskin, but it looks good as a reskin. So
I like that. So one of the things, the book eaters and the mind eaters have been compared to vampires a bit. But also one of the pieces of lore that you were digging into early on in your research was yokai, which is a book-eating creature in Japanese lore, I think.
It is, yeah.
How did that help feed in? How did it teach you how to stay away from the things that you didn't like about it? Because I love the idea of real life mythology informing fiction. So
yokai are more like the kind of equivalent of fairies. They're like a whole range of creatures and monsters and demons and things. And they don't have necessarily tight rules. Like there are ones that are famous, there are ones that are in lore. But the idea of book eaters exists in like at least one Japanese manga. I think they were explained away as being a form of yokai. But I mean, I looked into it as like writing the origins of book eaters as being from there, and then in the end decided I didn't want to just be like a weeaboo because I don't know what I'm doing with Japanese myth, and it just wasn't something I felt comfortable looking at. So I put it to one side and didn't go that route in the end.
Got it. I'm curious about your experience with the fairy tales of George MacDonald. You had mentioned this in a previous interview. I'm just kind of curious to get your initial reaction from that.
You've done your research, yeah. I read those as a child. I think they were very formative. George MacDonald is a really, really interesting person. He influenced Tolkien. He inspired C.S. Lewis, who called him master. He was mentor to Lewis Carroll, encouraged him in writing Alice in Wonderland. He wrote the first full-length adult fantasy novel. And his fairy tales are for the time, they're very feminist, they're very gentle, they're very forgiving. He was religious, but he didn't believe that hell was like a permanent thing. He was kicked out of church as a pastor for being too kind and forgiving. And yeah, he wrote great fairy tales that also serve as like an introduction to Plato, and they're really cool. I recommend them.
Nice. If I were to dig into the fairy tales of George MacDonald, is there a one particular story that stands out to you as being something that you enjoyed the most?
Probably the one that gets referenced in Book Eaters, The History of Photogyn and Night Terrace, or it's also called The Day Boy and the Night Girl. And it's just it's a really interesting fairy tale about a boy raised only in daylight and a girl raised in a dark cave. And there's a lot going on. It's like a witch conducting a social experiment to see what happens.
Oh, nice. Well, moving from George MacDonald, Bertrand Russell was another one that came up with you. The History of Western Philosophy?
Yeah.
How did this land with you?
My dad had a copy, and he always recommended it as being a good introduction to everything. I mean, if you read this book, like Bertrand Russell hardly has any footnotes. He's just writing stuff that he knows. And my father-in-law also had a copy. So when I met my ex at uni, and I borrowed my father-in-law's copy and read it. And it's designed for the layperson to read. It's very approachable. It's funny. It tells you stories about philosophers who thought they were immortal and jumped in volcanoes to prove their point. And and it's just told with this kind of humor and this charm, and it's very, very accessible, but it's very eye-opening as well.
Nice.
It really kind of digs into what we believe and why, and how all of Western culture is kind of really grounded in these ancient Greek beliefs. And it's very interesting.
Excellent. And you already covered Charlotte Bronte. I wanted to ask about Gene Wolfe.
Okay.
What about Gene Wolfe stands out with you?
Wolfe had this capacity to express complicated concepts in very simple sentences, and he has very detailed, nuanced, interesting work. I love that his narrators are unreliable. There's lots of depth there. I love that he doesn't explain things. I know that's something I do which frustrates readers, but I loved it in Wolfe's work. He would just casually mention, oh yeah, that's the tower of, what was it? The Tower of the Bear Tamers, where men train bears for war and then take bear brides. And it's like, wait, what? And then, it's never mentioned again. And he just had all these rich details in his world.
Just a little piece of color, we're off.
Yeah, just little things where it's like every tiny detail is kind of amazing on its own. It could be a book, and he just throws them in like their background.
That's phenomenal. At this point, I do want to get into you have described yourself as a serial rewriter and a serial editor. You start off with a construct. I've got a skeleton, I've got an outline, boom, and then you start. Do you get 20% of the way in before you've figured out where you're not enjoying it, or do you get all the way through and then come back and start again from the beginning?
Well, the book I'm currently writing, I think I was getting about 5% in and then rewriting. It really varies. I think 25% is definitely a crunch point, where it starts to be like, is this going to take off or not? 50% is another crunch point where it's like, is this a shape? I just kind of do rewrites as I go, I think, throughout. I think for this book I'm writing, that I had one draft that got to 50K before I chucked it. And that was a bit painful.
Painful, but necessary, right?
Yeah, it was necessary. It wasn't working. There was nothing wrong with the story other than the fact I just didn't like it.
Technically excellent, but I'm not enjoying telling the story.
Yeah, if you're not enjoying it, you can't, how do you know why a reader's going to like it?
So when you're writing and you're putting everything together, you're following the structure, you're going along the outline, you come back, oh, I don't like this. Oh, I'm going to chuck this 50. What stops you from staring down into the abyss and wondering, am I just falling or am I actually accomplishing something here? Because that seems like a very hard thing to do, especially after putting in all that effort, but you do it because it's the right thing. I understand you're an optimist, but I mean, that's a big challenge to go, okay, I'm going to keep going.
I guess because the idea won't leave you alone. So even when you take a break from it, you keep going back to it and just picking over the problem. And usually for me, I get to a point where I can't write, and it's because something's not working. And so your brain is just, subconscious brain is just in like, no, we're not going ahead mode.
Right. Okay. So you are an avid sci-fi enthusiast. So what made you decide, oh, I'm going to write a Gothic tale?
So I do like the older Gothic novels, the Bronte stuff. I'm probably more cosmic horror, I guess. I like more of that side. I do like fantasy. It's just, I'm a bit fussy sometimes with it. And I think I like fairy tales. And to me, I was writing a fairy tale. So it had, it has a fairy tale feel and a fairy tale structure and distant voice and a lot of tell and all that kind of thing.
Well, and fairy tale and Gothic go hand in hand.
Yeah, I think especially the Victorian fairy tales, they're quite Gothic.
So one of the questions from the Oasis that I was interested in is, what did you do when you knew the Book Eaters was going to be published? And we kind of talked about that a little bit in the beginning, but was there something specific?
So when you get your book deal, you can't tell anyone for ages, like 3 months minimum, until they have their announcements in place. So I had to keep it very quiet. I couldn't even tell my parents, because if I told my parents, they'd email all my extended relatives. So
God bless you, Mom and Dad.
yes, they're okay. It's just my grandmother would, tell everyone. So I think we bought a bottle of Prosecco to celebrate me going on submission, and we ended up drinking that to celebrate the book deal. And other than that, I think when the actual first check came in, I went into a bookstore and just like bought all the books I thought looked nice, just once for that experience.
Yeah.
You can't do that all every day, but it was, it was fun.
I remember Ed Sheeran said when he got his first record deal, he walked into the Lego store and bought the biggest Lego set that he could find just to celebrate. It's like, I can do this. Always wanted to do this. It's like, I'm going to go in, I'm going to buy 30 books. We're just going to take those out with us, a couple of rounds to the car.
I respect that he went and bought Lego. That's very cool.
So what was the biggest challenge you had during your writing process? And then the biggest challenge you had during the publishing process?
So the writing process, probably just getting stuck, not knowing how to end it. That's a common one. I get to 75%. It's like, oh, now what?
Where am I going?
And that usually triggers a big rewrite when I do figure out the ending and realize nothing adds up. Publishing, I think just that everything takes a lot of time. There's a lot of silence. My publishing experience is relatively good and relatively fast, and it was still, 6 years and a lot of rejection and a lot of silence. I think there's a lot of stress and not very much money. It's hard to pin down, but there's a lot going on with publishing. I think if you're an anxious person, the fact that everything's outside your control is really hard.
Right.
Yeah.
You had said during one of the interviews, his recommendation to writers is kind of recognizing the things that you can control and the things that you can't, and the things that are beyond your control, just being able to step away from them and saying, that's not me. That's got nothing to do with me. And you've talked about luck as well, being right place, right time is a big factor in terms of success when it comes to publishing.
Yeah, I think that's why the advice is to keep writing, because if you write well and you have the right books, then you're basically looking for the right person at the right time to take them. And that, the more often you try, the more your chances go up. But there is always an element of luck. And I think one of the things that's hard for people is that basically the fate of their book is decided the moment it's bought. And that's a very stark publishing truth that, there are exceptions to that.
Here or here?
Yeah, it's what tier you slot into. And after that, your path, your trajectory, the way publishing works at the moment, your trajectory is kind of set. So
it's established. See, now I'm picturing you writing kind of on a regular basis. And I really do picture you as this tightrope artist, balancing above the abyss and then going backwards to figure out where you're going. Do you have a perfect writing scenario? Can you write anywhere, anytime? I'm on a bus, I'm going to put it together. Do you have any odd quirks while you're writing that kind of keep you going?
Just whenever I can fit it in, I think. Because of writing around kids, there's not time really to write every day or to write regularly. So I do what I can in my head and then basically do sprints. I have more time now to sit and compile things, but I still find I have more time, so I procrastinate more, and it's not really helped. I like to do sprints. I like to use Squibbler. I think I've talked about Squibbler before. It's an online program where you set yourself a timer like between 3 to 10 minutes. And if you stop writing for more than a couple of seconds, it deletes everything you've written. So you've got to keep going for that chunk of time and stuff like that, just to get words done. So I have something to edit and something to revise.
That's phenomenal. And perfect writing scenario for you. Is that a cabin by a lake over a deck looking over the water and the geese? Or what does that look like for you? If you could have anything.
I think just a quiet room, and that's enough. A quiet room and a working PC.
Quite ruin a working PC. Two things you don't get with children in the house.
No, although they're in school and they spend half the week with their dad now, so it's okay. I do actually get time.
In that process, excuse me, in that process of being a serial rewriter,
Yeah.
is there anything that you jettisoned and left behind with the Book Eaters that you not necessarily regret, as in if I wish it were in the book, but one of those, oh, this was a great idea and it had to go?
I guess so. This is a little bit spoilery, I guess, but I regretted. I initially had Devon and one of the other characters, her romantic interest, kind of exchanging letters for a while, so the romance felt less abrupt, and that got taken out for reasons I can't remember, but I wish that stayed in. And the plot line with someone in Devon's family who she wasn't able to help was initially. So there's two people in Devon's family who she's trying to help, and she helps one of them in this book and not the other. And initially, both of them were in there, but there just wasn't space in the end.
So what's the difference between Book Eaters and what you're working on now? Book Eaters, you had... how are those two experiences different? Because book one, book two seem like entirely different things to me.
Yeah. They are, they're very different. So I can't write in that same world again for a couple of books until this contract's wrapped up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I did want a change of pace and just different. You're under a lot of commercial pressure, I guess, with the second book. Tor is basically saying, well, we want the same thing again, but different, but not too different, but not too similar. Not too genre, but also not too mainstream. And it was a really fine kind of tightrope to walk. So there's a lot of back and forth with my editors, like, what about this? What about that? And she'd say, oh, that's very sci-fi, or that's, because they had a specific vision for how to set up that career before you can kind of move into having a bit more freedom. Mm-hmm. And what they were looking for versus what I'm interested in writing, because there's to be a balance.
Mm-hmm.
There's a balance between what they expect and what I feel like doing. So I think that's different. That tug of war is really awkward.
Awkward.
Yeah.
In approaching second book, which has nothing to do with Book Eaters.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you've kind of spent the time on this emotional end of the spectrum with Book Eaters, and you kind of leave those fields for a while and let them regain the nutrients while you move over here and start playing with a different set of emotions?
Yeah, I think because there's such a long gap. There's 2 years between the book being handed in and coming out. There's a year after we'd finished edits. So for me, that book is done. In my head, I've moved on from it massively.
Yeah. Is there any particular way, like, if I remember correctly, the day the book came out, you did it right? You had a drink, you had a special day out of it. Is that right?
I think for the UK release, yeah. For the US release, it was so far away, and all the events were virtual, so it was more like life as normal. And then the evening, I logged on for like an hour to do a thing virtually. I think I just had a very quiet drink at home, yeah, for the UK one. I didn't have an in-person launch because I decided it would be too stressful. And in the end, that was a good idea, because with Waterstone's issues, my book wasn't actually in stock anywhere. So that would have been a humiliating disaster.
And we've both seen people go through that, and it's just like, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, I watched other people in my debut year have some terrible book launches that were not all their fault due to stock issues. I thought, just avoid that,
So did the Mind Eaters come into the process early, or did they develop after the Book Eaters had kind of been established in your head?
Almost simultaneously. There were initially loads of different kinds, and it just simplified down and streamlined into only 2.
Got it. Well, and you originally the collector was much more fleshed out and had a bit more backstory built in, right?
A bit more, but also he was more basically I had it more ambiguous initially, where there were kind of the book eaters are different factions, they had different myths about their origins, and some of them believed that they were from the collectors, and others had different ideas, and each had their own kind of developed thoughts about it. Almost, yeah, different origin stories.
So now that you're a published author, I mean, this has to feel like, bing, you check a big one off the list.
Yeah.
Is there a way specifically that it's changed your life? Has there been a single moment where somebody came up to you, or what's the biggest change in being pre-published and post-published?
The biggest change is financial, to be honest, because I was unemployed and had been 9 years out of work, so I had no real prospects at the time. That I was thinking, you know, in the middle of COVID, I'm going to have to try and volunteer or something to try and get back into work. The book deal really dug me out of a hole financially. It let me move. The flat I was living in after I left my ex was just like this mess that didn't have heating or hot water and stuff like this, and like no cooker in the kitchen, that kind of thing. So the first thing I did basically was like buy a new laptop because mine was dying, and then find a new place to live. So it made a huge difference. It did kind of overhaul my life. And it does. It's validating, but also the financial side's really helpful.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's physical, actual, tangible change in your life that affects you every single day.
Yeah. And you're very motivated for deadlines because you don't get paid till you hit them. So
right. That's my biggest part. So with the second book, would you be willing to tell us a little bit about, because I believe it's set in Hong Kong, but
yeah, that's fine. It is very different. So it's like a kind of historical fantasy with Chinese ghosts who are a bit different to Western ghosts. And it spans about 40 years, and it kind of tells two separate tales. One of a woman in her 40s living in the walled city. I don't know if you've heard of that.
mm-hmm.
Okay, the walled city slum in Hong Kong, which at one point was the most crowded neighborhood on earth.
Yeah.
And she's working as an exorcist for the triads, who are like the Chinese mafia. And there's things going on with her. And the other story is set during World War II, following a girl and her mother who flee to these islands to escape the Japanese occupation. And the stories are linked, but neither of the people in them are who they seem they are. So I don't know if it'll work, but we'll find out. It's a change of pace. It's 50% in second person, so it's got all the hallmarks of a second book flop, but that's fine because I'm enjoying it. So.
Well, and you're painting with different colors. You're kind of using a different emotional palette. You have an entirely different setting, and you've got an exorcist who can't exercise.
Yeah.
That's gonna be fun.
Well, I don't know. I think because the books are very grounded in locations, and different locations have a different feel to them. So the books end up having a very different tone. And the third one, if I get to write it, will be set in America, in the Midwest.
Well, good luck making that interesting. All right. I wanted to see if you are ready for 2 minutes with Sunyi Dean. Are you ready? Quick and lively. And I got to get my timer out. And we'll go from here. Are you ready to go?
I think so.
All right. We're going to make it happen. 2 minutes with Sunyi Dean starting now. What is your favorite sandwich and why?
As tall as possible, as many ingredients as possible.
Ooh. How many days would you last in a zombie apocalypse?
Slow zombies forever. Fast zombies, not very long.
Ooh, I like that. Slow zombies forever. Who is your favorite cartoon character?
Demona from the Gargoyles.
Oh, very nice. Do you have a favorite guilty pleasure?
I don't know, eating chocolate spread out the jar with a spoon, probably.
Absolutely. If you were going, who would be the perfect reader for the book eaters? What would that person look like?
probably, I guess, women with kids who read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy and feel tired all the time.
So almost everybody.
Uh,
Do you have any one single song or artist musical that stands out to you from your teenage years that you were just in love with?
I did not have any music until I was 15, aside from church music.
Oh,
But in my 20s, I'm very fond of Duke Special, who's a weird Irish pop singer.
did you have a childhood actor or actress crush?
Obviously, Patrick Stewart.
You can't get sexier than Sir Stu. What's the most embarrassing moment you ever had in your teen years?
I don't know where to start. I'm not sure. Sorry.
What's the craziest dare you've ever took?
Sorry?
What's the craziest dare you ever took?
To climb a metal pole in a thunderstorm.
Oh my gosh. Okay. And if you had one answer, what is the meaning of life?
There isn't one.
Oh, I'm so sorry. We're out of time. Thank you so much. I
No
appreciate
worries.
it.
It was